Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Leeds Minster. Particular welcome to our Deputy Lord Mayor, Councillor Barry Anderson. Very good to have you with us. My name's Paul Maybury. I'm Rector here at Leeds Minster and also Chair of Trustees of the Church Institute. Yesterday we celebrated 150 years since the death of Walter Hook. Walter Hook was a vicar here, and we unveiled a blue plaque in his memory and honoured his legacy on Sunday in the presence of the Lord Mayor and the Lord Lieutenant who did the deed of unveiling the blue plaque. I can't show you the blue plaque because it's in an office up the road until we get permission to put it up on the wall. The Church of England is good at many things, and one of the things it's very good at is rules and regulations about where you can put screws in a wall. So we're still having that debate and that discussion, but we will win, and the plaque will go up at some point. So watch this space. Is coming. But Walter Hook was a very honoured, rightly so, figure in the life of this city, and his statue is in City Square, if you've not come across it before, and a memorial of him lying in state is up here on the left, and of course there's the Hook Memorial Church, All Souls, Blackman Lane, and of course we are here for the annual Hook Lecture in memory of the great Walter Hook. So it's a great joy for the Minster to host this lecture, which is a collaboration between Leeds Church Institute and the University of Leeds. A couple of practical things. If you need the toilet facilities, they are in the City of Leeds room where you've walked through. There will be some refreshments served at the back at the end. If there's an emergency, we will tell you what to do. Go out the door. But we're not expecting that to happen. So without further ado, may I hand you over to the Director of Leeds Church Institute, Chris Swift.
Deputy Lord Mayor, honoured guests, it's a delight to welcome you here on behalf of Leeds Church Institute. As Canon Maybury said a moment ago, we are marking a particular moment, not only in this building, but also in the fact that Walter Hook established Leeds Church Institute in 1857. And of course it is in his name that this annual lecture is provided. Hook is a remarkable figure, albeit someone shaped by the knowledge and expectations of his time. A helpful reminder perhaps that this is also our fate today, and future generations may well wonder at some of our attitudes and beliefs. Hook was born and educated in the south of England. Arriving in Leeds in 1837, the populace was both sceptical and hostile for a variety of reasons, not least Hook's high church Anglicanism. But he won them over with both humour and bluntness. Early on, he wrote to his friend W.P. Wood as follows: "But oh, my dear Wood, such a church as I have, I really loathe it. I cannot preach comfortably in it, I can scarcely make myself heard, and the dirt, the indecorum, etc., etc., quite distress me." Those were the feelings that led Hook to obliterate the medieval church and oversee the creation of the structure in which we're sitting this evening. Hook was the driving force for the creation of the Leeds Church Institute. In fact, he purchased a library of 1,500 books from an institution that was closing and donated them to Leeds Church Institute. Hook's commitment to both education and public welfare continues to shape the work of Leeds Church Institute. This has been a part of our history from day one, with the officers of the council securing lectures by distinguished individuals. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome Jon Kuhrt, who's worked for over 30 years with people affected by homelessness and poverty. Jon's work comes with the conviction that Christian theology is best done when it is rooted in the practice of faith. As CEO of Hope into Action, Jon leads one of the UK's most innovative approaches to homelessness and demonstrates a commitment to both practical aid and prophetic witness. I'm delighted that Jon has agreed to give the Hook Lecture in 2025. We're very much looking forward to what you're going to share with us tonight. As Paul Maybury mentioned, this is a partnership, this lecture, between LCI and the University of Leeds. And I'm very pleased to hand over to Professor Johanna Stiebert to give a welcome on behalf of the university.
Deputy Lord Mayor, honoured guests, good evening. I'm here to represent Theology and Religious Studies as well as the Centre for Religion and Public Life, both at the University of Leeds. The annual Hook Lecture is each and every year a wonderful occasion to come together with shared attention and focus on the theme of shared relevance. And at this stage, this is our major event where we work together with the Leeds Church Institute, but we're building more connections with our students, with our colleagues. Speaking from the higher education sector, with our subject of theology and religious studies, like many other humanities subjects, under pressure and threat, it is heartening to see on a cold, dark autumn evening, so many of you here, affirming that religion is enmeshed in the personal, the local, and the geopolitical, and that prophecy continues to demand being heard and being heeded. So the University of Leeds joins and thanks the Leeds Church Institute and the Leeds Minster in eager anticipation of today's topical Hook Lecture. But let me hand over first to the Deputy Lord Mayor. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I am Councillor Barry Anderson, and I'm here on behalf of the Lord Mayor, Councillor Dan Cohen, and also with me is my wife, Councillor Caroline Anderson. Welcome to Leeds, and thank you for coming tonight. Thank you also for inviting us to join you for this very important occasion as we address one of the most pressing challenges facing our city, homelessness. Leeds is a compassionate city, and that's not just a slogan, it's a commitment to ensuring that no one in our community is left behind, and that every resident has access to safe, secure, and dignified housing. Over the past year, we've seen a troubling rise in rough sleeping across Yorkshire and the Humber, a 43% increase from 2023. In Leeds alone, the number of people sleeping rough rose from 49 to 69. These figures are more than statistics. They represent real lives, real struggles, and real urgency. We know that homelessness is not always visible. Many people are sofa surfing, living in temporary accommodation, or enduring unsafe conditions just to avoid the streets. These hidden forms of homelessness are just as critical and demand our attention. That is why Leeds City Council has refreshed its homelessness and rough sleeping strategy 2023 to 2028. This strategy is not just a document, it's a roadmap for action built in collaboration with our partners, frontline organisations, and people with lived experience. Our strategy is built around 4 key ambitions. 1, universal prevention, investing in education and early intervention, ensuring that people know where to turn before a crisis hits. Targeted provision, where we're reaching out to those whose homelessness is hidden, young people, LGBTQIA+ individuals, and those at risk of repeat homelessness. We are working to make services inclusive, trauma-informed and accessible to all. Intervention and recovery. Through strong city partnerships, we're ensuring that rough sleeping is rare, brief and non-recurrent. We're expanding outreach, improving temporary accommodation and supporting recovery pathways. Integrated housing options. We're building a shared approach to housing, ensuring every contact counts and every person matters. We're working to provide the right mix of housing options, from supported accommodation to permanent homes. We are proud that in 80% of cases, we've been able to deliver a positive outcome for those who approached us for help, well above the national average of 54%. But we are not complacent. We know there is more to be done, and we are committed to doing it. We call on our partners, our communities, and our residents to join us in this mission. Whether through volunteering, advocacy, or simply extending kindness, we all have a role to play. Let us work together to ensure that Leeds remains a city where no one is left behind, without shelter, without support, or without hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And it's a real honour for me to be invited to give this year's Hook Lecture. So a real thanks to the Leeds Church Institute for this great honour. I'm from South London, but actually I've already seen a number of old friends here tonight, which has really given me a really warm welcome. And just before I start, I would just like to begin with a prayer. Lord God, revealed in Christ, be with us tonight through your Spirit. May the thoughts of our hearts and the words of our mouth serve you. May tonight help each of us to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with you. Amen. I believe the question that we're looking at tonight could not be more relevant or timely. We're living in times of significant change, of significant anger, of real anxiety. Consensus is breaking down, polarization is breaking out, and the evidence is seen both online and on our streets. Wealth and property are increasingly held by a smaller and smaller number. Our housing crisis deepens, and trust and confidence in mainstream political parties is at rock bottom. Pope Francis described it not as an era of change, but a change of era. And these divisions and tensions are fueled by social media corporations making vast amounts of money from algorithms designed to appeal to the worst human instincts, feeding us a diet of content curated to play on our insecurities, to bloat our own sense of righteousness, and to feed a collective addiction to anger. I think W.B. Yeats's famous lines seem more relevant than ever. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And I believe that we should be preparing for things for our communities to be getting tougher in the next few years. Sadly, I don't believe that it's a time for much optimism about what the future can hold. But conversely, it's all the more important that we're people of hope. And as was said earlier, I work for an organization with hope in its name, Hope into Action. And I'd love it if people could leave with one of our impact reports that we've got at the back. We're a Christian charity who work closely with churches to house people who've been homeless. And it has been alarming for us in the last few weeks to see how the direct impact of the national tensions, especially those related to immigration, have directly affected our churches, our staff, and worst of all, made many of our refugee tenants feel threatened and unsafe. I've constantly seen over the last 30 years that despite whatever difficulties people face, hope is a vital ingredient of transformation. Hope unlocks a sense that things can be better, that the future can be different to the past, that there's something to aim for, something to live for. And I stand here tonight as someone convinced by the hope that I found in Christ. This isn't a sort of vague sense that things are going to be okay, an optimism perhaps that we find in an idea of the goodness of humanity, but a hope, and especially in honor of Walter Hook tonight, a hope that's similar to what I know about him, that is rooted in what God has done through Christ, what he is doing through his Spirit, and what he will one day complete. What does it look like to put this Christian hope into action in today's world? What's the church called to be at this moment of turmoil and increasing poverty in our country? Because this subject we're looking at, prophet or provider, is so relevant because over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been absolutely no shortage of church-based social action initiatives starting up. We've seen warm hubs, debt centres, and countless homeless shelters. And most notably, food banks, a form of social action that was virtually unknown 20 years ago. 77% of food banks are based in churches. But the overall picture of poverty in the UK is deteriorating. It's a bit similar to the list of initiatives the Deputy Mayor was reading out. There's no shortage of initiatives, but rough sleeping is rising. Poverty, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, that in 2025, over 21% of our country is living in poverty. In my work in homelessness, rough sleeping across the country has risen by over 20% in the past year. And there's currently a record 131,000 households in temporary accommodation. So despite the heroic efforts of voluntary projects, charities and churches, despite the stream of advocacy groups vowing to end poverty, there is no sign of improvement in sight. In fact, the trends mark further deterioration. So I believe strongly that the church's social witness stands at a crossroads. I think now is the time to grapple boldly and faithfully with the challenges our country faces and seek answers that are rooted in Christian hope. We shouldn't get drawn into celebrating the growth of social action because it proves the church is somehow useful. We need to go deeper than that. We need to draw on our traditions, our biblical theology, to be self-critical, ask hard questions, and consider the right road to take in the next 20 years. Are we content to be the providers of handouts? Or do we have something genuinely prophetic to say to our rich, polarized, unequal, and angry country? This is what we're going to be looking at tonight. And I'm going to start by unpacking what I believe is a holistic model of poverty, to look at the problem we're seeking to address, and talk about the relevance of both grace and truth. I'll then talk about what I believe it is to be a prophetic provider, and end with 3 directions for Christian social action for the future. But I want to take you back a few years. I was invited to speak at the Greenbelt Festival. Put your hand up if you've ever been to Greenbelt. So it's quite a few of you there. I thought so. I was asked to lead a seminar called Getting Real about homelessness. It was actually, they asked me to speak about grace and truth and how to make help with people facing homelessness effective. And I was a little bit concerned that a very sort of liberal left environment like Greenbelt, I think that's a safe thing to say, that everyone would be in danger of kind of agreeing at a seminar. Homelessness is bad, the government's not doing enough, etc., etc. So we wanted to inject some tension. And we mixed it up by getting an actor to come in at the start of the seminar and pretend to be someone homeless. And this guy came in at the back. There's about 300 people in the marquee. He started mumbling at the back, swearing a bit. And you could see these kind of ripples of discomfort traveling through the marquee. Then he walked down the front, grabbed the mic off the person introducing the seminar, and told everyone he was homeless and he needed help now. He explained that he'd jumped over the fence because he'd heard there were a bunch of Christians here. And he made a raw appeal for cash. Now, we'd arranged for two of us to do kind of impromptu speeches about whether we should give him cash or not. I was given the job of doing the speech to say we shouldn't. My wife was a bit worried I'd be sort of run out of Greenbelt for being uncompassionate. But we asked everyone to actually separate, to stand up and move to one side of the marquee if they would give money and the other side if they wouldn't. And I have to say the stunt worked a treat. It certainly created some tension. A lot of people simply didn't want to move at all. And what it did was it created something that is often lacking in conferences and seminars talking about social justice. Because it made people grapple with the genuine tensions involved in helping others. And it led to a conversation that was far more honest than it would have been otherwise. And one of the people who got up to speak after that discussion to share their story was a guy called Chris. This is a... Oh, here we go. My clicker's not working. Here. Oh, there we go. Great. It might zoom on now about 4 times. There's Chris, a picture of him. This guy, Chris, got up and shared his story. He talked about being street homeless for 3 years as a drug addict and an alcoholic. He told everyone his moving story of basically growing up in a tough area, joining the armed forces, experiencing trauma, and sliding into addiction when he was discharged. His wife ended up throwing him out because of his behaviour, and he spent 3 years sleeping rough on the streets in London. He ended up with an attempted suicide. And Chris's story is the kind of one that I'd heard countless times through the years that, by then, the 20 years I'd been working with rough sleepers. And it illustrates the ingredients of poverty that lie behind homelessness. And I just want to share this model here. Firstly, there's a poverty of resources. You know, Chris is from a poor background. And today, I think the most obvious factor is material poverty that lies behind homelessness, the cost of living, debt, unemployment, underemployment, the insecurity of zero-hour contracts and the gig economy. But most of all, towering above everything else, there is simply not enough affordable housing in our country. Too many luxury apartments are being built, rather than the council housing and affordable housing that we really need. But homelessness is more than just resources. It's also a question of a poverty of relationships too. Because every homelessness story includes a story of broken relationships. People have nowhere to go because they end up having no one to go to. And issues of domestic violence, abuse, family breakdown are all too common. And relationships are core to what it means to be human. And isolation and loneliness are just as deadly as cold temperatures. And thirdly, perhaps most deeply of all, there's the poverty of identity. Not just that people's relationships with others are fragile, but people's relationships with themselves. Low self-esteem, mental health problems, and the addictions that are so bound up with those issues all undermine someone's very sense of self. And as I've learned over the years, that inner homelessness can be far harder to change than external needs. So homelessness is not a standalone issue, but an amalgam of many. It's a barometer of social need. It illustrates political failure, community breakdown, and personal tragedy. And it's much more than houselessness. Houses are vital resources. They're one of those three circles and absolutely vital. But homes are much more than that. Homes are places of relationship and places of identity. And as Chris's life showed and the story he shared that day, an addiction can rob you of all three. They can take your resources, destroy your relationships, and scar your very identity. And this is why addressing homelessness involves much more than just the allocation of a flat, the distribution of resources. And it's why it's not a problem that the government can solve alone. The government can allocate resources, but what they can do to affect relationships and people's identity is far more complicated. I actually worked as a specialist rough sleeping advisor for 4 years for central government, which included the COVID pandemic years. And even with the offer of a free hotel room, there were still 2,000 people sleeping rough on the streets of the country during the height of the pandemic. And this wasn't simply a lack of resources. More than ever, in my experience, there actually was a blank check to help people. But those people remained on the streets because of a chronic combination of the poverties of relationships and identity, which meant they didn't have the trust to accept the offers being made. And what I believe as a Christian is the church has the ability to respond to all three of these forms of poverty. It's what Hope into Action does. We provide the resource of accommodation through people investing their wealth and with the professional support to go with it. But we also offer relationships with a local church, the friendship and community of a local church, and of course, most deeply, the opportunity to transform your identity through employment, through volunteering, through giving, and also through exploring faith. So I really strongly believe it's very complicated, homelessness, but the church's response, as we've seen throughout history, has been one of being involved, making a difference. Let's go back to my friend Chris, because after 3 years on the streets and a spell in psychiatric hospital, Chris got a flat, but actually in terms of addictions, his life was very similar. He started going along to his local church, seeking food and money, but he was often demanding and pretty abusive. People gave him food, they were quite nice to him, some even baked him cakes, but in Chris's words, he was a bit of an arsehole. That's the way he described himself. But the local church did help him get his life back together, and he was actually at Greenbelt because that local church had brought him along to that festival. And what was fascinating in listening to him is the most decisive thing the church did was not the obviously compassionate things. Actually, it was an intervention by an older lady called Doris. So when he was kicking off one day and making a right scene, Doris looked him in the eye one day and told him what she really thought of him. She told Chris that he stunk, that he looked disgusting, and that he should stop abusing himself and others and sort himself out. And Doris's words provoked him. They made him angry, but they made him take stock and look at himself. And Chris has now been sober for 17 years, and he counts his recovery journey as starting from that conversation with Doris. As he said, everyone else was nice, but it was her truth that got me on the road to recovery. Now, I'm not recommending everyone does a Doris. This was in a particular context. But it's a brilliant illustration of what I've found in my professional experience over the last 30 years. And I want to talk about this blend of grace and truth. It says at the start of John's Gospel that Jesus came from God the Father, full of grace and truth. And I think this balance, this tension between grace and truth has absolutely been at the heart of my work, and I think it's critically important. Here we go, I'm going to press this on. Just have a look at it if you can see it. On the left-hand side, it might be a bit small for people at the back, but at the left-hand side, there's a column called an emphasis on grace. And we've got these great words: unconditional acceptance, giving people another chance, showing compassion, providing support and care, advocating for people's rights, showing hospitality, saying yes to people. I put this up at a night shelter conference a while ago, and I had people saying, "Amen," because they love those words on that left-hand side, and they're vitally important. They're one of the things the church does brilliantly. But many people think that helping people is just about that left-hand side of the chart. But this is naive. These qualities are vital, but they're not enough by themselves. And I think almost anyone who's run anything or had any responsibilities, perhaps especially a family, can appreciate the importance of the right-hand side as well. The importance of enforcing rules, maintaining boundaries, administrating justice, being challenging and empowering, just like Doris was. As well as people having rights, they've got responsibilities. As well as being a guest, they often need to be treated as a client to get things sorted out. As well as saying yes, people have to accept being said no to as well. And this tension, this balance has been incredibly important to me in the last 30 years. It's helped me make good decisions, maintain boundaries, avoid burnout, and best of all, focus on what's most helpful for the people I'm trying to serve. And relevant to what we'll talk about, I think it's provided some really solid theological foundations for my work, which is so needed. And this journey has led Chris, this impact of Chris has led him to become a great family friend. This is a picture of how Chris is with me. This is me and him. We've done a lot of speaking engagements. This is me and him outside Lambeth Palace, just a place drop. We've spoken at St Paul's Cathedral. We've written a booklet together. This is him down at Lee Abbey, where we led a weekend. Chris has been volunteering for the last 10 years in a centre for rough sleepers and now helps train psychology students in trauma and recovery. And I firmly believe that we are called as Christians, to people of goodwill, to love our neighbours. But a fluffy, sentimental form of love doesn't last long, and especially doesn't last long in this kind of work. I've come to believe that the reason that grace and truth are so vital is because they are the primary ingredients of love. And grace and truth is what love is. So what does this look like to embody this in our social action? Well, I like the title of the lecture tonight, but I don't think we should accept the dichotomy it sets up between being prophets and providers. Everything I share tonight has been learnt primarily from the experience of delivering and running frontline services. And I believe that we find a truly prophetic edge when we're based on practical experiences. Ernst Troeltsch wrote this. He said, "We theorize and construct in the eye of the storm." We learn from being involved in real people, in real situations. I think we should be suspicious of theory that's too academic, or a theology that's too abstract or detached from real experience. I don't think we do need prophets who have no experience of providing. However fluent they may be in talking, blogging, or vlogging about social justice, their words need to be honed by the messy realities of providing practical help. I don't believe keyboard warriors will inherit the kingdom of God. But equally, we don't want to become providers who are so wedded to the status quo because their vested interest in charitable models or government contracts that they're not able to stand back and look at the big picture. We must resist the coziness to the powers that be that compromises speaking the truth. I believe we need prophetic providers. And I think the best way to talk about what a prophetic provider is to talk about real people. So I want to take you on a little tour of my career And the 4 founders and key people in the 4 charities that I've worked for in the last 30 years. I'm going to put them up here. One more. So it's a bit of a stretch doing that each time. Sorry. There we go. In the 1990s, I went to work for the youth charity Centrepoint. It was founded by the Reverend Kenneth Leach. Who's heard of Ken Leach? Yeah, exactly. Great. So we've got a lot of Ken Leach people. That's great. Ken Leach was a passionate socialist, an Anglican priest in the Anglo-Catholic tradition. He was curate in a church, St Anne's in Soho. And in the 60s, he opened up his church crypt for homeless young people. And the reason they called it Centrepoint Soho was because it was a prophetic statement against the big tower block at the end of Oxford Street called Centrepoint, which at the time was empty because of tax breaks it was getting for being empty. And I became manager 30 years later of that same shelter on the site of the Centrepoint at St Anne's in Soho. And it was brilliant for me as a manager to read Ken's books on sacramental theology and social action, and actually a real pleasure to get to know him and talk about these issues with him. Ken set up a practical project of Centrepoint, but was a prophetic provider. After that, I went to work for the Shaftesbury Society, a far older and larger charity, which was set up as the Ragged School Union under the patronage of the Victorian Earl, Lord Shaftesbury. He was nicknamed the Poor Man's Earl because of his tireless political work against factory and the child labour that was run in the factories at the time, as well as the political action he was doing in the House of Lords. He was a patron to a whole load of Christian mission in the urban slums. He left an incredible legacy of mission churches, of services and schools for people with disabilities. A lot of people don't know that the angel statue at Piccadilly Circus is named after him. It's erroneously called Eros. It's actually the angel of Christian charity. And it's set up in his honour, just near Shaftesbury Avenue, which is also named after him. In 2010, I went to the West London Mission, Methodist organisation, again formed in the Victorian era, running services for rough sleepers, bail hostel for people coming out of prison, hostels for teenage mums, and it was the organisation that set up the first ever creche in the UK for working mothers. And a lot of this was developed by the Reverend Donald Soper. Again, like Leach, a passionate socialist who's famous for his outdoor preaching. It's estimated that in the course of his life, he preached over 10,000 sermons. He answered over 250,000 questions from hecklers. During World War II, Soper was banned by broadcasting for the BBC because of his pacifism. And he was the first Methodist minister to go into the House of Lords. And coming up more to the current time, in 2023, I went to work for Hope into Action, a far younger charity formed in 2010 by Ed Walker. Ed came back from working with Tear Fund in Africa and was struck by the homelessness in Peterborough. And when he and his wife received an inheritance, he decided to use that money to buy Hope into Action's first house and partner with the local Baptist church. And in the 15 years since, Hope into Action's grown into a network of 131 houses all over the country, purchased by people who want to use their wealth in an ethical and impactful investment. Our staff provide the professional support, and every house is partnered with a church. So all of these 4 men, and I apologise for the lack of gender diversity, they were all very different from different times. Soper and Leach were sacramental socialists. Lord Shaftesbury was an aristocratic evangelical Tory. But each of them had a prophetic vision for how the Christian faith makes a practical difference. All 4 were what you could call providers who oversaw work that was anchored in their vision of God's kingdom. They didn't simply preach. They didn't write books alone. They didn't just set up think tanks. Just like Walter Hook, their faith was incarnated and embodied in providing practical help. And the thing I'm most passionate about, and I think the thing our country needs more than ever, is an integration of practical action, prayerful discipleship, and politics. I think it's this blend, this mix, that will make us prophetic. And this is what we need more than ever. So hopefully I'm doing okay time-wise. I'm coming into land, into my final sort of section of what I'm going to say, because I want to talk about 3 directions for the future of Christian social action. Perhaps these are the things that we want to be talking about and discussing further tonight. In 2023, I wrote an article that was published in Christianity magazine titled "The Sins of Social Action." A bit like that stunt at Greenbelt. I did want to do something that was provocative, that would get people reading, and it certainly seemed to do that. And I critiqued 3 disconnections in Christian social action. These were firstly, the disconnection between charity and justice. Secondly, dependency, the disconnection with empowerment. And thirdly, secularization, the disconnection with faith. And I believe it's these 3 sins that cause Christian social action to slide into simply being providers and losing that prophetic edge that we're talking about. And I knew the article was onto something when so many people from a different range of backgrounds, whether political or theological, liked and shared it. But it was all for different reasons. I wasn't surprised that my left-wing friends really applauded what I was saying about structural injustice. But they were a lot more nervous about what I was saying about dependency and the importance of personal responsibility. Those on the right tend to really applaud charitable activity and emphasize personal responsibility, but often want to give a free pass to the systemic failures of the market to provide adequate housing. And across the board, I think so many social activists are challenged but remain deeply nervous about being distinctive in our Christian faith and working against a secular tide. And as I said, I think being prophetic involves holding these things together, avoiding the echo chambers that we're surrounded by more than ever, of left and right. And the prophet Micah, the Hebrew prophet, offers us a great structure in this famous verse in Micah 6, verse 8, where he answers this question: what does the Lord require? And his answer is that we act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And in this last section, I want to just set out 3 directions for what I think is a more radical Christian social witness that responds to each of those 3 sins. I'm going to put them up. Whoops. So these are firstly, the first one is political, talking about acting justly, looking outward to challenge economic power. The second is practical, loving mercy, looking inwards, examining ourselves about how we run social action projects. And the third is theological, walking humbly with God. How can we look upwards to maintain a confident Christian distinctiveness? So firstly, challenging power and economic justice. Brazilian Archbishop Dom Helder Camara famously said these words. He said, "When I give bread to the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why are the poor hungry, they call me a communist." And it's a quote that captures this inescapable tension between charity and justice. How does our social action connect to the underlying social and economic systems that create such need in the first place? And homelessness illustrates this so starkly. As I said earlier, there's more people in temporary accommodation, despite all of these initiatives, than ever before. Temporary accommodation in London alone costs the public purse £5 million every single day. The financial cost is eye-watering, but the human cost is worse. 2 weeks ago, it was announced that over 1,600 people had died homeless in the last year. And these figures just reveal the fundamental structural injustice of our housing system. It's broken, and it will not be solved by voluntary action alone. And I strongly believe the church should not accept the role of being kind of handmaiden to the state, running around filling in the gaps caused by government neglect and market failure. We must not be seduced by the lure of feeling useful. The two key themes in biblical prophecy are idolatry and injustice. And I think we see both of them in our contemporary housing system, because our houses have become idols that society worships. Rather than affordable housing, we see constant developments of luxury units popping up all over our cities. Local to me, there is what I think is the abomination of Battersea Power Station, a former public asset pumping power into the capital has been turned into a soulless luxury block of flats. They might win architectural awards, but they are the opposite of what South London needs. At the same time, you've got couples in my community, both working, struggling to afford any form of accommodation. This is rank housing injustice. I think it's the number one social problem we've got in our country, destroying communities and squeezing people's lives. But we also need, as well as affordable housing, we need work that pays, work that gives dignity to employment. People shouldn't be reduced to being just mere units of labour, manipulated for profit. We need to demand an economy which generates decent, dignified employment. And I believe that poverty will never be ended while we have a low-wage, high-welfare economy in place. We also need a welfare system that incentivizes work. At the moment, we have dependency and negative incentives baked into our system. I believe the late Labour MP, Frank Field, was a real prophet when it comes to this. He coined the term the benefit trap, where people are better off on benefits than they are taking work. And he said that our welfare system was a full frontal attack on a working class moral economy that believes in work, effort, savings, and honesty. The inequality gap in this country continues to grow. The top fifth own 2/3 of the wealth. The bottom fifth, 0.5. Top fifth, 2/3 of the wealth. The bottom fifth, 0.5. Our focus needs to be on this unjust political economy. I think social justice, rather than being drawn into identity politics, really needs to focus on economics. We need to speak truth to power. And economics is where the power lies and where the injustice is in our country. So that was the first point about challenging economic power. The second is perhaps closer to home, perhaps more relatable for those of us who run social action work. I want to talk about changing practice, about empowerment and the contributory principle. Because the hard truth is that not all responses to poverty are helpful or effective. A huge amount's been learnt about what's effective in the majority world in terms of addressing poverty. The book Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo really argued powerfully that aid from richer countries actually often serves to disempower economies and create poverty and deepen poverty. And the book Toxic Charity by the US activist Robert Lupton's been a big influence on me. He says too often social action deepens dependency, destroying personal initiative. He wrote this: when we do for those in need what they have the capacity to do for themselves, we disempower them. And he makes a really important distinction between crisis and chronic problems. He says so much of our projects are responding to people in crisis, when actually most of our charity goes on people who face predictable, solvable problems of chronic poverty. An emergency response to chronic need is at best counterproductive and can be, over time, actually harmful. And as I've seen time and again, the crisis response to poverty is very easy to fall into. Projects that offer a one-way exchange are straightforward. They're easy to set up, and frankly, they're often popular with volunteers. I've been really concerned over recent years, to visit soup runs or churches where there are armies of well-meaning middle-class people running around serving people who are turned into passive recipients. I think the biggest need in homelessness isn't simply to give away more resources, but how we can help people maintain their accommodation, to pay their rent, to form positive relationships and use their strengths and skills. Catholic social teaching, I think, has a lot to offer us in this area, as well as the principle of solidarity with the poor. There's also the principle of subsidiarity, that responsibility should be taken at the appropriate level, empowering people to help themselves. Pope Benedict said this: subsidiarity is first and foremost a form of assistance to the human person which respects personal dignity, by recognizing in that person a subject who is always capable of giving something to others. And I think the growth of social action in this last 20 years has often been too much focused on giving out resources that can end up digging a deeper hole for the people it's seeking to serve. I've come to believe that doing a cooking class for 10 people can be more valuable than giving free food to 100 people. And I think it's because of this contributory principle that empowerment and reciprocity are so vital to the dynamic of helping others. I think in food initiatives, this should look like a shift towards people paying at least something towards the food they're receiving. In homelessness services, this does look like empowering people to pay their rent, contributing to their own recovery. I don't believe people are transformed by simply what they receive, but what they contribute to and what they give and participate in. I believe the social commentator Darren McGarvey is a real contemporary secular prophet. His book, Poverty Safari, is, I think, the best book on poverty I've ever read, because he is willing to talk both about structural injustice, what I was talking about in that first point, and this second point of personal responsibility. He wrote this, he says, "We deny the objective truth that many people will only recover from their mental health problems, physical illnesses, and addictions when they, along with correct support, accept a certain amount of culpability for the choices they make. Yet such an assertion has become offensive to our ears, despite being undeniably true." And he says that he recovered from his homelessness and addictions. He says, "My life began to change when I got less offended by the truth. Some of my problems were mine to solve." And I believe, again, referencing this theologically, that too often social action shows a form of grace detached from this form of truth. And it's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer coined as cheap grace. So earlier I said we need to speak truth to power, and I believe that strongly. But those who are powerless also need the truth. Not a truth that's going to castigate or condemn them, but a truth that helps them find dignity and liberation. The truth that can set people free. And that's a good segue, because of the person who said it, to my final point about deepening spirituality and having confidence in our Christian distinctiveness. Finally, and it's great we're in a minster here, because I believe we need to look upward to God, like the very design of this building leads us to, and renew a confident commitment to Christian distinctiveness in our social action. The missionary theologian Leslie Newbigin's been the biggest influence on me. And he writes in his biography about helping out a Welsh mission to help unemployed miners, and this is back in the 1920s. But it was a strict liberal ethos that meant anything in terms of religion was excluded from the program. And he writes this, he says, "As the weeks went by, I became less and less convinced that we were dealing with the real issues. These men needed some kind of faith that would fortify them for today and tomorrow against apathy and despair. Drafts and ping pong could not provide this. They needed the Christian faith." And Newbigin, some of you might be familiar, he wrote a series of greatly influential books. But this single phrase, drafts and ping pong could not provide this, has always stayed with me. It's always challenged me about a kind of creeping secularism that can come into my work. And I've seen so many organizations slide in that direction when any reference to the Christian faith is lost. The homeless sector is packed full of agencies that used to be Christian. Faith sometimes fades because of a lack of passion or confidence. Sometimes it's fear of what funders think. Often it becomes fossilized when the founding ethos is just neglected. Sometimes it's based on a kind of false concern about Bible bashing or coercion. And it means that rather than something dynamic and creative, faith often just becomes a slightly embarrassing footnote in the history of an organization. The fruit of action becomes detached from the roots of faith from which it's grown. And I think this is absolutely tragic. Paul Bickley, who worked for Theos, wrote a really good booklet called The Problem of Proselytism. And he talked about how so often faith is kind of skimmed out, like milk. Faith bit is skimmed out of social action. And I've spent most of my life working in that kind of skimmed end of work, if I'm honest. I've tried to make it a bit more semi-skimmed over the years. But I joined Hope Interaction 2.5 years ago because it's an organisation with what you could call a full fat faith. We make no secret of our desire to integrate passionate faith with professionalism. If faith in Christ is our engine, it's what motivated Ed Walker to put his own money in to get our first house. And that investment, he put 30 grand in 2010. We've subsequently had 1,000-fold increase on that. Over 32 million has been invested in our houses. And this has really chiefly been powered by faith. Faith motivates our churches to be involved, our volunteers, our staff. But most importantly, faith is so relevant to the challenges our tenants face. And on the front of our impact report here, you can see a picture of Susie. I'm going to put a picture of her up here. Susie, like Chris, I was talking about earlier, was a former drug addict. She spent time sleeping rough. She spent time in prison. And she's a Hope into Action tenant. And she's been an incredible journey. She's actually speaking at a conference alongside the Archbishop Stephen Cotterill today down at the V&A in London. So she's gone a long way. But faith has been so relevant to our tenants' journeys. Not a faith that's offered with any strings or any coercion or any pressure, but 60% of our tenants want to be prayed for. 14 actually got baptized last year. And this is the sort of secret sauce of what we do. Yes, Susie's there with her professional empowerment worker, Rach. The professionalism is vital. But this is also just as vital. That this is Susie surrounded by her church family. People who are not paid to do the work, but who are part of her local community. People she spends time with. And just a few weeks ago, Susie took the decision to be baptized. And there's a picture of her being baptized both by the local vicar alongside her empowerment worker. So being openly and confidently Christian does not mean abandoning professionalism. Our full fat faith has not stopped us winning awards from secular bodies such as Homeless Link, the Centre for Social Justice and The Guardian. And I believe that the times call not for shy Christianity but boldness. Many young people are being drawn back to the church at this time. Recently in my church, we had the baptism of 5 young people on one Sunday. And it's because they've seen something compelling in the Christian faith. Can the Christian social action offer something similarly compelling? Not just the service, but a confident Christian message that is integrated with it. So I'm just going to finish now, but I want to talk just at the end about Christian faith as what I think it can be, as the great disruptor. I talked at the start about how I think we're entering tough times. I think just like Joseph and his famous dream in Egypt, I do believe the next few years are going to be really tough. We don't have a cause for optimism, I don't believe, but we do need to be a people of hope. Leslie Newbigin was asked once whether he had optimism for the future, and he said this: I am neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. What did he mean? Well, as I said earlier, I don't think it's a vague feeling that everything's going to be okay. But we can build real communities forged on the hope of Christ's resurrection. The first fruits of what God will one day complete in the new heavens and the new earth. And I think we need to have a radical witness. I think many founders of the charities, perhaps Walter Hook himself, might be dismayed to see what modern charities have become, just as commissioned arms of the state. The word charity, the word voluntary sector have almost become misnomers because they're so dominated by state funding. I find a lot of third sector conferences are not places for genuine debate, but often where the same safe mantras are being trotted out. I believe Christian social action should stand distinct and seek to shake the status quo through political voice, through prayerful discipleship and practical action. We need radical solutions that go beyond sticking plaster solutions. And I think being prophetic involves holding together and integrating that the world cannot. Justice, mercy, and walking humbly with God. We need to be willing to challenge across the political and theological echo chambers. We need a holistic understanding of the material and relational poverty that plagues our nation. We need to speak with both grace and truth and to live this out through our social action. We need to call for both structural change and personal responsibility, for a more just political economy and more stability in family life. To proclaim good news, but to live it out practically. To speak of both justice and Jesus. To be both prophets and providers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm sure provided an enormous amount of food for thought and discussion, which we will have time for shortly. But I'm now going to call upon Rabbi Robyn Ashworth-Steen to come and make a response to what John has shared with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, John. You can sit now and enjoy your time more. I have the pleasure of responding to your lecture. It's so powerful to listen to the, in your words that you used in your draft, the messy business of the field that you're in, really the reality of it, and the wisdom you've shared from the decades that you've worked to make structural change and real difference. So thank you for your service. And thank you for this talk, which refused to be drawn into binaries, which is so refreshing in the world that we live in. Prophets or providers, charity or justice, structural change or personal responsibility, but one that demands more from each of us in this space, spiritually, politically, economically, religiously, personally, and communally. You reminded us of the power of not losing the humanity at the heart of these systemic failures we are facing on so many levels, and to ensure that our response is practical but not wholly transactional, and fundamentally that it's relational and anchored in religious values. So I'm going to draw out just two main reflections for us all to help you process all that you've heard so that we can have a great conversation after. There are 2 points that I'm going to respond on, and that's from my position as a PhD student at the University of Leeds, working on feminist prophetic leadership, and as a community rabbi and in the community, and also as a former human rights lawyer. So I'm going to bring some of that into how I respond. So there are 2 main points I want to respond on. One is the really rich pair that you brought of charity and justice, and the other around Christian distinctiveness. So, first of all, charity and justice. And I wanted to also share a story and a memory, as I was reminded of a day, it's a few years ago now, that I often think about, and I feel really quite ashamed of my response. I'm going to briefly share that moment and a Jewish teaching, because I think it complements your vision and teaching tonight. So I was a communal rabbi in Manchester for 6 years. And one morning I turned up to the synagogue for the Shabbat morning service on a Saturday, and the police had cordoned off part of our road, and we were told that someone had died that night, and it was a rough sleeper. I learned a little bit about what happened, but was quite busy that morning, went into the synagogue. I mentioned it during the service that someone had died, and did feel motivated and ensured that we carried on doing the broad-based community organising our community was part of. But I know I could and should have done more. I felt stressed and busy. I didn't go down to talk to his friend that was there, and I never found out his name. We have to find time and make space for the faces of the people who are being let down time and time again. You shared the statistics, really shocking, and also earlier today, that it was announced that over 1,600 people died homeless last year, and that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation reports that over 21% of the UK population are living in poverty. These statistics must be made real, as you have for us, and as you warned, that it doesn't become a purely academic or abstract debate, but it's a call to action. So here's the Jewish teaching. It's from a midrash, a kind of teaching upon the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, from Pesikta de Rav Johanna, but the name's not important. But it's from about 400 to 700 CE. And there was a Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, went to Rome, and he saw marble pillars there, which had been carefully covered in wrappings to keep them from cracking during the heat and the cold. But by contrast, he saw there a poor man who had no more than a reed mat under him, sleeping under the marble pillars that had been covered, a reed mat under him and a reed mat over him to protect him from the heat and cold. And I've always found that teaching so powerful, and to me it really speaks to what you're teaching us about the systemic and the personal, that we have to hold the two together, but we also can't see the things distinct from each other. The building had more worth. The idols of the houses and the buildings that we're building have more worth than the human lives that are suffering. You spoke at the beginning too of the intersecting systemic harms of the world we're living in and the time of significant anxiety and anger, and I certainly feel it in my body almost every morning when I wake up. And this is true of the prophets. As they say in Ecclesiastes, Gehelet, there's nothing new under the sun. The times of the prophets were also times of anxiety, of structural harm, of empires taking over peoples, of threat, of violence, and of wholesale change and destruction. And the power of the prophets, as you've outlined, was to offer a grander vision, to see the bigger picture, and remarkably, to demand more, not only of the leaders, but of their people and themselves, and even of God. They were truth tellers. And they held it with some grace as well, but primarily they were the ones telling the truth. And you've offered us that vision of the possibility of communities, religious communities, responding on all fronts: resources, relationships, and identity. At its best, you've taught us, communities can understand that homelessness is not a standalone issue, but illustrates social, political failure and personal tragedy. Yet I also know that religious communities, like society at large, can be lost in charity over justice, social action over social justice. And leaning into the political and economic is so needed. As a rabbi, and I'm sure it's the same for my Christian clergy and others here, I've often been told that politics is not welcome in the sanctuary. Okay, they're good. There's some not good, but you're with me. It's not just in my world. But of course, everything's political. And these times carry out for a political and spiritual response. So I would add to what you say, to say in your call to action from working in your field, our communities need to be braver. They need to meet the challenges that you've laid at our feet. We need to study and we need to recognise that our prayer is political, that the lives that our members lead are impacted by economy and politics, and that these are divine concerns. We need to intentionally organise ourselves and leaders around our relational power to meet the demand. And I think that's the work of Walter Hook, his legacy that he leaves. Or as Abraham Joshua Heschel taught, who wrote a foundational book on the prophets, few are guilty, but all are responsible. That we need to recognise in our prayer and in our sanctuary spaces that we are all responsible. To do that, we then can challenge power and can challenge our practice, as you so powerfully said. So that's my first challenge for us, building on your points of charity and justice. We must be braver in our religious spaces and not put in a little package the justice work we do or the social action we do, but integrate it more widely into everything we do religiously. We need to add to the work of our food collection by asking why in every space we're in. So the final point was on the use of religious language, of making a case for Christian distinctiveness in the work done by Christian and Christian charities. It's vital, in part because we continue to see the misuse or misappropriation or interpretation of religion, which rather than being distinctive, is particularist and tribal. As you noticed, you mentioned Pope Francis early on, who was really a spiritual and religious leader who worked against that. He spoke, I think, to the best of us in terms of what we can be as religious leaders, as he spoke of a change of era. So I was reflecting in your talk on what do we mean to be a prophet? And they actually all had very different responses, as we know. I think someone on the left, I often like to think of them as, justice warriors speaking truth to power. But we know that's not exactly the case for all of them. We have Nahum. It's a short, violent book if you've read it. And he really wanted violence enacted on the enemies of the Israelites. No holds barred. The prophets could also be very misogynistic. They were quite violent in how they spoke about justice, in denigrating women as using imagery as well. Some of them were part of the establishment. They actually wanted a return to the status quo. And I think sometimes when we say prophet, we conjure up the latter prophets, the male prophets, and forget maybe the female prophets, Miriam, who I think is an exact example of the prophetic provider. She's embedded in community. She moves in community and brings story and dance to the women around her. Prophets, I'm trying to say, can marginalize as much as they can't. They can just preach and not do, which is exactly what you are asking us to try and hold, the tension of preaching and doing. At their best, prophets are at the margins, involved in community, as you said, can see the bigger picture, speak truth. You may know the work of Walter Brueggemann, who's who passed away this year, the famous Christian scholar who also wrote foundational books on prophets. And he said the power of prophets is to criticize and energize. And I was really reminded of that teaching in your talk. You said in your words, we need a need for hope, that the future can be different to the past, that there is something to aim for, something to live for. This is the criticizing, the energizing, and you held that in perfect balance for us tonight. And I think as our call to action from it is to uplift the prophetic voices which are doing this holy work, and also note the false prophets who are doing something different with religious language, with Christian language, with Jewish language, with all different types of language. A lot is at stake in what you're having to say for us. You said we need to draw deeper on our traditions and biblical theology. And that's because we know what happens when people are dehumanized and when they're, or on the other side, when they're empowered, seen and valued. We know what happens when we construct an understanding of these issues as them and us, which you drew out, or just simply us being together. There's one last point I wanted to say before I finish my response so we can hear more and have more conversation. You said this sentence which really struck me. You said we need to be willing to challenge across the accepted boundaries of theological and political tribalism in your draft and in what you were challenging us tonight. It's really important that we hold on to our distinctiveness of our own identity. You spoke about the poverty of identity in relation to homelessness, but really our own identity as well. And you spoke of the quote from Leslie Newbigin, which really challenged you said about ping pongs, and it was a very powerful quote. But I have to admit, I also found it challenging, but maybe for a different reason. There was a phrase that said, they needed the Christian faith. And I know I'm in the margins slightly here by being a Jew and a rabbi in the space, but I found that quite hard to take, that in part of the provision or prophetic provision, there is a sense that there is something that is needed from specifically the Christian faith. And is there openness and space for faith or spirituality more widely, or even no faith at all? And I think that picture sat differently because of that quote of what does that mean? What's the win of our work? Does it have to end with being baptized? And I don't think that's what you were saying, but that quote brought it out of me. So I wonder whether we could also add, how do we avoid subsuming but make sure there's a path for everyone in their walking humbly with God, or not with God at all, just in spiritual and deepening of identity as well? How do we allow for each other's distinctiveness in these spaces? And how can Christian hope meet Jewish hope, meet Muslim hope, and even meet secular hope? I'm hoping that it's through our commonality, our relational power, your challenge and wise words, that we can do this work together, across boundaries and divides, with a shared language and the need for hope, and perhaps to create hope together. You've laid out the directions and the path. You've given us some language here and some framework, and I hope we can take some steps together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you again to Jon and also to Robyn for the response. We were just talking some really provocative thoughts, reflections and ideas, and I'm sure that will also be true of those who are here this evening. So without further ado, if you would like to ask a question, if you could put your hand up. Emma, who's one of the LCI team, is here and will bring a roving mic over. If somebody would like to indicate that they have it. It's always hard to be first, isn't it?
Hi, I'm Phil Arnold from an inner city church in Armley. I guess one of the challenges that I face in the immediacy of lots of need with food banks and refugee charities and lots going on is having the space and the headspace and frankly the energy to challenge power. And as someone who's been very involved in frontline work yourself, Jon, I wonder, how do you do that? How do you carve out the kind of prophetic, if you want to use that word, focus when you're sort of inundated with need and the things that we want to share with people, but also how do we do that?
Yeah, shall I take that? Yeah, I'm conscious that it could sound like a big shopping list. On top of everything else, you've got to do all these things. I do think it's where collaboration and participation in initiatives. I know Andrew Grinnell here? Is he still here? Very involved in the sort of poverty hearings work. And I think that there are those, what you're doing locally, I think, needs to be contributing to a bigger picture, so that those stories, that information can be fed up. I mean, I think it's one of the things that the Trussell Trust have done well with their network in that they've tried to collate the numbers so they can make a collective challenge. So I can appreciate it's not simply down to local people like you facing so much need to do everything and more. But I think for me, it's the connection. I think what you said about everything is political. And of course, Ken Leach, actually, the guy I was talking to who founded Centrepoint, he said all Christians are political, whether they realise that or not, but especially when they don't realise it. That was a good quote. But the idea that, well, what is this saying? What are the needs in our community saying about the structures that exist? And, I've spent most of my life working in Westminster, where, you've got the wealth and the poverty so extreme. And I think there are real opportunities there to make sure that voice of what you're seeing practically is shared, especially through the sort of national networks. I was always very keen when I was working for the Methodists that the Methodist team who produce reports actually come and spend time in the homeless centre, but they were sometimes a bit reluctant to do that. But, I think that's where the best learning happens, in picking up on what people like you are seeing on the ground.
Thank you very much. Is there another question? Yep.
I've come across a number of charities here in Leeds, which have been set up by Christians, set up by people of faith. Not necessarily to push their faith or their Christianity, but to serve the community. I've come across a charity that works in schools for young people, charity that works with debt. It goes on and on and on. I mean, people here in the audience will know of those charities. But what is always the problem is the funding of those charities. You go to the funders and they say, well, you're a Christian charity. You're a charity of faith. We can't give you any money. And yet there's what you talked a minute ago about wealth. There's wealth in this country that could go towards these charities, but they're not allowed to have it because they say you're pushing something which we don't believe in. So I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got no problem with the church setting something up, and then if they intentionally let it go to become more secular, I think that can sometimes be the right thing, depending on what the project is. What I see, though, is often just a slide, where there's just a loss of nerve. Things get eroded gradually or diluted. And suddenly a church it happens with preschools and things like that happen in church buildings and then gradually separate, and they have a big bust up. Local to me, a church fell out with its preschool and they chose to evict it, and you had children with placards saying Jesus wouldn't kick us out. And it was a disaster because they hadn't really worked on that integration. So anyway, that's key. I think with funding, there are some organisations, definitely funders, who have a lot of questions about faith. But in my experience, actually, there is a lot less restrictions than we sometimes fear. And I think if we explain what we're doing openly, so of course, you use the phrase push faith. Well, I hardly meet anyone who just wants to coerce or just hammer people. It's just, how does faith live as an offer alongside what we're providing? So it's got to be optional. We developed a few years ago a charter for Christian homeless organisations, and we committed, lots of organisations signed up saying we won't be conditional, so you don't have to do anything spiritual in order to get the service. We won't be coercive. We'll have no hidden agendas. And it was designed to be able to be sent to funders to say, this is how we're operating. And, I think some of the most nervous groups actually can be corporates and companies who give money. They're often, I would say, the most sort of faith-phobic around. Whereas quite a lot of funders, with the lottery or the big funders, Garfield Weston and loads of different funders, I think if you explain clearly what you're doing, I think there can be opportunities. So it is a problem, but I think we can often, certainly Hope into Action, we get a lot of funding because we're Christian. And we have to work hard at keeping it. But actually, hopefully a bit like tonight, people who, may not believe everything I've said, but they can have respect for what faith leads to, and they can look at it and think, yeah, it's a good thing, it's making a difference. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. We've also had the facility for people to text a question, so I've got a couple, but I'll ask one first and then go back to the audience. How can churches provide the practical and spiritual support alongside the professional you speak of when the professional infrastructure isn't there? So all we're presented with are broken people. Where do we start, and what realistically can churches hope to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't think that the church, the local church, can take responsibility for every single need that comes to its door. I think we need to have some boundaries in terms of what we can achieve. But just in my local church, on a Wednesday night, we have a community meal. And what we try to do in answer to the first part of the question is to offer some resources. But actually, the best thing we're offering is community. And we work really hard at making sure there's a really fun atmosphere, there's games, there's interaction. We don't want one of those situations where all the volunteers are huddling in the kitchen and all the sort of recipients are outside. We want that good blend and that mix. But what we do is often advocate for people, because they come with all kinds of issues and complexity to do with their housing situation, and we phone people up that relate to their issues the next day to try and bring in some sort of support from us. Now, those professional groups, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room are involved in similar things, but there are some things we can do. We want those people to know we're standing with them. But I think the best thing we can do is offer community, friendship, love, that reciprocal stuff I was talking about. And also, it's been really important for us to have a liturgy that we say, and we always say it if you want to, don't say it if you don't. But it's really added depth, that rather than just providing food. People say, yeah, we're at church, of course we should be praying, And it's this kind of thing that I think has made what we're offering different and distinctive, and also sustainable. Because, we can't meet the needs of everyone. We can't solve all their housing situations, but we can do something. And I think there's a liberation. I think Oscar Romero did a famous prayer about there's a sense of liberation in knowing that you can do something little and do it really, really well. So I do feel that we can't think like, if we think we've got to solve everything, we do become the handmaiden of the state, driven by another agenda. Whereas perhaps we've got something distinctive and different that no one else can offer.
Thank you, John. If anybody has a question for Robyn, I did ask her during the break. She's perfectly willing to answer one as well. So the gentleman, a couple back there, and then John Swales I can see at the back next.
Yes. Does it work? Can you hear me? One word that comes across to me is empowerment. I don't think you actually said the word, but I think you actually said it in many other ways.
Yeah, I've got it on the screen here.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah.
There we go.
Right, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
I need a new pair of glasses. But how do we stop being good Christians, going to do good in darkest whatever? It's how do we actually give empowerment to the people we are there to help?
Yeah, I'll say a few words. I mean, John Swales might well be able to speak brilliantly to this as well, because I think that we call our staff empowerment workers at Hope into Action because we want that in the very DNA of what we're doing. So I think often it is about making sure there is mutuality in what's going on, that it's not just running around serving people. It's, well, what can people contribute to the evening? What can they bring? Not clearing their plates for them, but having decent systems where people do it themselves. At our place, everyone cleans up at the end, and it's really good. And just last week, someone said, "Oh, I want another cup of tea," and we had to say, "Go and get it yourself." These things are humanizing, and I think that's why I told that story about Chris being challenged, because there was a humanness in that response. It wasn't all just you're the alien, you're a kind of noble savage who I've somehow got to serve but keep a distance from. People who are homeless have all the same dreams and desires we often do. They're often covered in a crust of pain and brokenness. But of course, underneath it, they're people, and people that I don't think are transformed really by what is just simply given to them. You know, people don't say, my life changed when I walked into a church and they gave me a bag full of free stuff. You know, they talk about, actually, when I go to rehabs, often talk to people about that trigger of transformation. It is often being challenged or realizing their own responsibility, their own agency. So I think it's a bit of confidence. And the reason I'm critiquing the growth of a lot of distributing of resources is I think it exacerbates divides. You know, turns people into people just to be served rather than to be drawn into community.
I'll just go on to my question. So, John Swales from Lighthouse. John, thank you for just a real rich feast of a talk. The church should take its prophetic voice in speaking truth to power, but I also would wonder in what sense we also need to speak truth to ourselves, speak truth to ourselves about how bad things really are, how bad the system really is, how, you know, in a world of climate breakdown, homelessness is going to be absolutely catastrophic. We can't avert a catastrophe. It's a better kind of catastrophe. So speaking truth to ourselves, and also speaking truth to ourselves about Jesus, who spent a key aspect of his teaching ministry was calling out the hoarding of wealth. And that's a message I don't often hear in the world, where we're not hope-filled realists in the church. Often we peddle hopium, where we give people a shot of hope, which distracts them from life as it really is. What would your response to that be, John? Thank you.
Thank you, John. I often used to think about working with a lot of heroin addicts, you know, and Marx's quote about religion being the opium of the masses. You know, what I think that heroin, you know, makes people incredibly kind of feeling amazing whilst all around them is chaos. And I think that can be a danger for religion, you know, just an escape from the brutal reality of the world. Now, how that, in a church like mine, I think a lot of the people seeking that most are some of the people in the most difficult situations, so it needs handling carefully. But I think that it's the real prophets. I absolutely take Robyn's point that the prophets are a mixed bag doing lots of different things, but a lot of the ones whose message cut through, it's not a positive message. It was the false prophets who were saying things are going to be okay. And I think how we expose the brokenness of the system and the realities of this, how we are not just embedded and enmeshed in them. And I would agree that one of the things I like about Hope into Action working there is that we haven't just got a ministry to people affected by poverty, but we've got a ministry to people who are carrying wealth. You know, because the very rich Christians I know are very bothered by how much Jesus talks about money. And they know that they've got to, how they use their money is the most spiritual decision they have to make. I just don't think there's enough talking about it. I think the size of the mortgage we take is the most spiritual decision we ever take. I know so many people who are locked into things that don't give them much room to express their faith because they're devoted to paying their mortgage. You know, and so there just isn't enough talk about this. How much we talk about, you know, Jesus is, how much we talk in the church about sexuality versus money. You know, it's well out of kilter. I really recommend a book called The Anti-Greed Gospel that I read by a guy, Malcolm Foley, in America. And he argues that all racism is rooted in economic greed. So I'm just rambling a bit, but I just think this problem, we've got to look full in the face of our brokenness. And Jesus picks out mammon as the God that we are most in danger of following. He could have picked loads of other gods, but he picks mammon, that you can't follow that and Jesus.
Well, I think we're coming with the last question, I'm afraid.
Hi everyone, thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed the lectures. I guess I've really appreciated the angles and the different things that were spoken about. I guess I just wanted to add on a different dimension that came to mind, that was this thing that the idea that we need money is something that has been culturally created. And there was once a time when we didn't have to work and we didn't have to, there's this kind of idea that food comes from somewhere and we buy it, or, a house comes from somewhere and then we buy it, is kind of almost this new concept in a way. And I think maybe it'd be useful for us even to challenge this as like a cultural norm, that like we must get ourselves into this dynamic in order to live. Like, it should never have been this hard to live, and yet here we are, like absolutely tied to like working crazy hours, often like for no like obvious like benefit to anyone. And I think that maybe this is also something that we can question when we're talking about poverty, is like, we don't just need to create more money and give it to other people so they can buy things like us. It's like we want to empower people to be able to live sufficiently so that they can, they can give the means to their life from themselves. I don't know if that made any sense, but that's just what came to mind.
Yeah, I mean, this phrase about, I heard about, living simply so others can simply live. And the radical, I think this is why I did want to be quite full on about my faith. I think I believe more and more in this radical call of Jesus. I hopefully not, I read, it's really important, the point Robyn brought out about need. I think I've found I've had the most respectful conversations and partnerships, running night shelters with people with a synagogue and a mosque in Westminster, was where we were confident about what we really believed. Not to judge or to create a hierarchy so much as just be confident, have what Newbegin called proper confidence in the gospel. And I think that Jesus' radicalism is the best place to go when we're thinking about what religion needs to look like. I think it's the thing that saves religion from irrelevance and detachment. His words, his lifestyle, his commitments, for me, are right at the heart of the hope of challenging power, changing practice, and deepening a commitment to him. So, keep up the radicalism. It's really interesting seeing so many young people get excited about the Green Party, their message about taxing wealth, not work. I think these things are really interesting as a counterbalance to some of the uglier noises that are going on. So yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you very much indeed, John. I'm just going to bring things to the close because I did promise we would finish at 9 o'clock, which we're going to do. I think John will be around at the refreshments. So if you have had a question that you haven't had time to raise, I'm sure he'll spare a few moments to talk with you about that. So some thank yous just to conclude with. Thank you to the Deputy Lord Mayor and Councillor Caroline Anderson for being with us this evening. Really appreciate this civic presence with us because it's so important to the city, which obviously is in the title of the organisation I lead, and where we are, most of us are living and working. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Canon Paul Maybury as Chair of Trustees, but also as Rector of Leeds Minster, for allowing us to host this here and for giving us such a warm welcome at the start. Thank you to partners at the university, Professor Johanna, but particularly to Rabbi Robyn for her response, which was just such a delightful perspective and insight, and a personal response as well to what was shared with us by John. I think having that from that perspective has just added something very special this evening. But most of all, thank you to John for what he shared with us, for coming and being with us and speaking so passionately with experience, conviction and insight into issues which we all find daunting and difficult at times. And as the questions have said, people can feel browbeaten by the circumstances of life and want to do more, but it's not always easy to know how. I was reminded at a conference I attended elsewhere in Leeds on Saturday that hope can be hard work. It's not wishful thinking, and perhaps tonight, amongst many other things, we've been reminded of that. And finally, thank you to all of you. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you to colleagues from Leeds Church Institute who facilitated and made this possible tonight. And details about next year are on the back of your programme for tonight, so do please put that date in your diary. I hope to see you before then, but if not then. So refreshments are at the back for those able to stay for a little while and have a drink of something. You're very, very welcome indeed. But thank you for being here. Thank you to Jon.